St. Mark's, may the peace of Christ be with you all. If there's a day in your life when you could wish everything went right, some people would wish that day to be the day they got married. You want everything to be perfect on your wedding day. You want the perfect wedding dress. You want the perfect hair and makeup. You want the weather to be perfect as you say your vows to your perfect partner. But I'm sure there are some of you here today who can testify that weddings are hardly perfect. In fact, some of you have probably been to a few weddings when things didn't go as planned. For example, here's a wedding ceremony that got started on the wrong foot, and by that I mean literally the foot of the bride's father, who accidentally stepped on the bride's wedding veil, causing her to violently turn her head and shriek out in pain. The next picture is a more zoomed up picture of her shrieking in pain. Here's another wedding ceremony that might have gone on for just a little bit too long, where the flower girl had a hard time staying awake and just decided to lay down on the steps and take a little nap. Here's another wedding where things didn't go right, when at some time during the ceremony, the groom just started to faint. He was either overcome with emotions or maybe partied a little too hard the night before at his bachelor party. At this particular wedding ceremony, this next picture, which took place on a dock overlooking a beautiful lake, when it was time to exchange rings, one of the rings accidentally fell out of the minister's hand and slipped between the wooden beams down into the water below. That's the picture of the bride and groom frantically searching and looking down between the cracks, trying to find one of the wedding bands. And here's one more wedding ceremony where the unthinkable happened. It was during a famous TV sitcom show called Friends, season 4, episode 24, where Ross and Emily, during the wedding ceremony, during the exchange of vows, when Ross was supposed to say, "I, Ross, take you, Emily," instead he said, "I, Ross, take you, Rachel," which was the name of his ex-girlfriend. Yeah, I saw that one, and wow. No recovery after that. Thanks for the pictures, David. Wedding days are the days you hope everything goes right, starting with the ceremony and ending with the reception and everything in between. You want the weather to be perfect, you want the music to be perfect, you want the food to taste great, and you want the entire evening to be memorable. But as you and I know, things don't always go according to plan. There was a famous wedding in the New Testament that Jesus attended. That's part of our story for this morning. Jesus was there with his mother, Mary, along with the 12 disciples. We're not told how the ceremony went, how beautiful the bride was, or how handsome the groom was, but when it came time for the reception, everything was going just fine until the moment Mary realized that the wine was running out. That may not seem as an embarrassing moment as the ones that we just talked about. It's not like the groom said the wrong name or the groomsman fainted. But when Mary realized that the wine was gone, she knew something important was at stake. And that's when she turned to Jesus to call in a divine favor, because even something that seemed small wasn't too small to bring to Jesus. Our passage for this morning on this third Sunday in the season of Epiphany comes from John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. This morning I'd like to read to you the Message translation. Be easier for you to follow on the screen above me. John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Let us prepare our hearts and minds for the reading of God's word. 3 days later, there was a wedding in the village of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. Jesus and his disciples were guests also. When they started running low on wine at the wedding banquet, Jesus' mother told him, "They're just about out of wine." Jesus said, "Is that any of our business, mother, yours or mine? This isn't my time. Don't push me." She went ahead anyway, telling the servants, "Whatever he tells you, do it." 6 stoneware water pots were there, used by the Jews for ritual washings. Each held 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus ordered the servants, "Fill the pots with water," and they filled them to the brim. "Now, fill your pitchers and take them to the host," Jesus said, and they did. When the host tasted the water that had become wine, he didn't know what had just happened, but the servants, of course, knew. He called out to the bridegroom, "Everybody I know begins with their finest wines, and after the guests have had their fill, bring in the cheap stuff, but you've saved the best till now." This act in Cana of Galilee was the first sign Jesus gave, the first glimpse of his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This is the word of the Lord. We don't hear a whole lot about weddings in the Bible, and the ones we do primarily come from the Old Testament. There was the mentioning of the union of Isaac and Rebekah, as well as Boaz and Ruth, and then there was that famous one where Jacob married 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel, 7 years apart. Remind me to tell you about that wedding. Talk about things that could go wrong at weddings. That one tops the charts. No, the Bible doesn't say much about weddings, but we know from history and from culture of the ancient world that weddings were very different back then than they are today. For starters, weddings back then often lasted several days and sometimes an entire week, and it wasn't just an event between 2 people or between 2 families, but often involved the entire village. You also didn't need to RSVP to these wedding banquets or ceremonies because it was just naturally assumed you would be there, because when weddings took place, the entire village basically shut down. Weddings back then were also more than just about love and romance. They were often about family survival or economic stability or strengthening community ties. Jesus even used a wedding banquet as the backdrop of one of his parables, if you recall, and we learn from that story how weddings were different back then. There was no exact starting time. There was also no RSVP required. You were expected to be there, and to not show up was more than being impolite. It was an insult to the family and the host. Now, somewhere during the wedding banquet in our story for today, Mary noticed something that nobody else did. She noticed that the wine was running out. The Message translation said it this way: "They're just about out of wine." Listen to the NIV translation. "They have no more wine," which makes it sound a little bit more serious, but whether their wine glasses were completely empty or just down to the last few drops, Mary was the only one to notice this and told this to Jesus. "They have no more wine." I've done this before, but that's such a unique phrase and such a rare phrase, and I'm sure as you hear me saying it, you're dying to say it too. So all together, let's say that phrase in one voice. "They have no more wine." Now let's try to capture the spirit of Mary reaching over, leaning over, and saying this to Jesus. One more time. "They have no more wine." What kind of statement is that? Mary wasn't telling Jesus what to do. Notice there's no demand in what she said. She was merely making a statement. But I think we all know, given the context, that this was between a mother and a son. Jesus knew exactly what he wanted his mom to do. Wouldn't any of us? Honey, we're out of milk. Honey, there's no more toilet paper. Honey, the trash can is completely full. Now, that's not just for my edification. There's an action assumed in those statements, and I think we're, old enough to know there's something implied. A simple statement, Mary said, just stating the obvious, but with a few simple words, Mary conveyed the request which Jesus fully understood. They have no more wine. Well, after a little back and forth between mother and son, between Mary and Jesus, Mary grabbed the attention of a few servants and told them to do whatever he told them to do. And so they brought out 6 stone jars, each with the capacity of 20 to 30 gallons, and they filled them up completely with water. Then Jesus told them to fill up a pitcher and bring the pitcher to the host. And when the host took one sip, he could barely believe his eyes, for this was the best tasting wine he had ever had. So then the host, as the story goes, went up to the groom, and this is what he said: "Everyone I know begins with their finest wines, and after the guests have had their fill, brings in the cheap stuff, but you have saved the best till now." Well, the groom didn't know what to say because obviously he didn't know what happened, and so he probably just had that look on his face and nodded his head, thinking that the servants may have found a secret hidden stash of wine. And after the conversation was over, the groom probably went back to sit down while the host went to hosting, and the servants quietly faded into the background. And that's the end of our story. According to scriptures, this was the very first miracle Jesus performed, and yet hardly anybody even noticed. Nobody besides Mary noticed that the wine was running out. None of the guests noticed that their glasses were half empty. Nobody besides John noticed Mary leaning over to whisper something into Jesus' ear, and nobody besides the servants knew where the wine came from. Hardly anybody paid attention to Jesus' very first miracle, which makes me wonder, how many other miracles did Jesus do that went unnoticed in people's lives? How many other wedding banquets did Jesus save? How many people, unnamed, unknown, did Jesus cure? How many disasters, man-made or natural, did Jesus prevent, and people didn't even notice? In the season of Epiphany, we are reminded and encouraged once again to pay close attention to all the miracles that we may have overlooked. God moments that we simply wrote off as a coincidence. Acts of God where we fail to recognize the divine, like the guests at the wedding who enjoyed unlimited refills, not knowing who was behind it all. I wonder how many miracles God has done in each of your and my life that we were completely unaware of. One morning, a woman in Michigan opened her mail expecting another letter from the collection agencies. She already had a mountain of medical debt that she could not pay, and each collection notice made that mountain seem higher. But then at the bottom of the pile, there was an envelope that looked slightly different, and when she opened it up, the letter said that her entire medical debt had been paid in full. There was no strings attached, no follow-up notices, just the good news that she was now debt-free. To make sure that this was not an accounting error, she called up a phone number that was listed on the letter, and it turned out she was one of 1,900 families who also received such a letter, whose medical debts totaling almost $1.8 million, had been erased by a very small church in Wyoming, Michigan, through a nonprofit organization that buys and forgives medical debts. What she thought was an accounting error was actually God working behind the scenes, and had she not reached out, she would have never known. Again, I wonder how many miracles God has done in our lives that we were never aware of. Miracles that God took care of but never took credit for. Billy, that job you didn't get, that wasn't me closing a door. That was me saving you from a place that would have been a dead end. Billy, you thought that phone call was a coincidence, but it came exactly when you needed it. Billy, you'll never know it, but I softened that person's heart way before they even walked into the room. Billy, you thought there was no more wine and people were going to find out, but I took care of all that way before everyone was going to notice. God doesn't send out notification letters letting us know everything he did, and God often does all these things without applause and without explanation. And oftentimes, just like the wedding in Cana, the miracles that Jesus performed are behind the scenes when no one is looking except for the very few who are paying very close attention. Again, how many miracles has God done in your life and you were never aware of it? Now, the miracle Jesus performed at this particular wedding, turning water into wine, was the very first miracle Jesus performed. And as far as miracles go, this one was pretty awesome. Think about it for a moment. Jesus took plain old water and turned it into wine, and not just any wine, but the best tasting wine that the host had ever had. I'll admit that that detail is lost on me because I'm not a wine drinker, but apparently there's a big difference between the cheap stuff and the good stuff. But if you were to look at all the miracles Jesus performed over the course of his life and ministry, for example, the feeding of the 5,000, the healing of so many numerous sick people, the calming of the storm, the curing of the blind or the lame, even the raising of Lazarus from the dead, the miracle of turning water into wine seems kind of pale in comparison, doesn't it? What I mean is, in the miracle of turning water into wine, nobody's life was saved, nobody's illness was cured, nobody was raised from the dead. This was not a life or death moment. This was just a wedding banquet, and the wine was almost gone. Did they have something else to drink? Sure they did. They had plenty of water. It's not like they were out in the desert and hadn't drank anything for several days. They were at a wedding reception, hardly a life or death situation. Think about it. Nothing was broken. No one was blind. No one's life hung in the balance, and unlike other miracles that revealed a theological truth or demonstrated the power of God, the miracle was just about wine, and the only thing Jesus saved was a community celebration. I say all this to contrast Jesus' first miracle with the other miracles he performed, because sometimes I think in our understanding, we tend to believe that the miracles we can ask God to do in our lives have to be the really big ones or the really important ones where there's a lot at stake. Like the miracles we throw up to heaven while we're sitting in the emergency room, or the ones we ask for when we're down in the ninth inning, when things are urgent, when the stakes are really high, or when it's life or death. But the miracle Jesus performed at this wedding shows us something entirely different. It showed us that we can come to God even when it's not an emergency, and even when it's something small. Have you ever had your own "they have run out of wine" moment? Let me ask it again. Have you ever had your own "they have run out of wine" moment And what I mean by that is a time when something mattered to you, but maybe not to anyone else. Maybe it was something small. Maybe it was something trivial, and yet it mattered to you. Maybe it's a relationship that needs healing that no one else really cares about. Maybe it's a conversation at work that you've been avoiding to have. Maybe it's something you're worried about, either for your kids or for your parents. Maybe it's a decision you're agonizing over or a disappointment you can't share. And while it might seem trivial to others, it's a really big deal to you. What the miracle at the wedding in Cana showed us is that no request is too small, and that if it matters to you, it also matters to God. Jesus once said in his Sermon on the Mount, "Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they?" So if God takes care of the smallest of animals, how much more does he care for you and us? If God notices when a tiny sparrow falls, if he provides for the birds who cannot plant or harvest or save up for tomorrow, then surely God sees the things that matter to you, even the things that might seem insignificant. So maybe you're not praying to God to let God know that you're running out of wine, but there is no ask that is too insignificant, no request that is too small, and if it matters to you, it also matters to God. The season of Epiphany is about seeing God revealed in unexpected ways and in surprising moments, and when the ordinary becomes extraordinary vis-a-vis the water into wine. Sometimes God works quietly in our lives, like the miracle no one saw, transforming the small things into things that are meaningful. Other times, God cares about the little things, the everyday worries, the quiet concerns, things that might seem trivial, but they matter to us. As you go into this week, may the story of the wedding in Cana remind you to pay attention a little differently. And if your wine glass seems a little empty, don't worry. God might be quietly working behind the scenes, transforming even the small things into something extraordinary. And all God's people said,